right, folks, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. This is Nostalgia Trap. Today we're talking about George Carlin with my good friend and frequent co-host Justin Rogers Cooper. Both of us were sort of shocked, honestly, that we haven't done a show about Carlin before, and it seems like an appropriate moment because Carlin had a particular skill in making comedy out of the horrific state of humanity, and he had a way of articulating things that I think we try and get at on this show. Carlin is influential deeply, and I think that's part of the reason Justin and I wanted to talk about him. This episode sort of rhymes with and fits in with our trilogies and episodes talking about Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky. These are sort of the radical dudes that blew our minds when we were in our 20s for whatever reason. There were these, curmudgeonly old men that had fucked up things to tell us about politics and society and culture that I'd never thought about before. Carlin definitely fits in there. If you want to check out those other trilogies, by the way, I think they go well with some of the thoughts and ideas we share in this episode. Go to our Patreon page. I'll put a link to these trilogies and episodes about Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky. And honestly, the Patreon page has a lot more to it than there used to be. And you can get it for free now, a 7-day free trial. So if you want to go sign up and check out all of our stuff for free for 7 days, that's a pretty good deal, honestly. You had to pay $5 just to check it out before, but now you can do it for free. And if you like what you hear, you can keep subscribing and pay $5 a month for access to our huge library of episodes. I think we've got one of the largest libraries of bonus episodes of any podcast. And I can tell you, I stand by everything we've put up on that Patreon page. So go check that out. I hope you enjoyed our conversation about George Carlin. He's someone who, like I said, he's deeply influential, I think, on a whole generation of people. But like our conversations about Zinn and Chomsky, I think Justin and I had a desire to sort of overturn a little bit why there's such hero worship with these men and what values we took from them. Because in a lot of ways, these are sort of like father figures in the American counterculture. And certainly in radical politics. So Carlin has a very, very particular place because he bridges, outside of the left wing and into popular culture in really, really interesting ways. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you for being a Nostalgia Trap listener. Here is me and Justin Rogers Cooper talking about George Carlin. All right, Justin Rogers Cooper. Good to see you. How's it going?
Good to see you too. It's going okay, although honestly, it's always crazy, and things can be better. But
I hear you.
But I'm good. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're entering the season of darkness. I think we changed the clocks back. Is it back? Yeah. Very soon, and that to me, it's weird. It's weird how much a profound effect that has on the mood of the day and the mood of the world. It's weird. Even living in Southern California, or where winter isn't as pronounced a thing, it feels the same to me.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of used to getting up before dawn now. And so I guess it will be somewhat easier to get up and, see the sunrise again, because those train rides in during the week, it's like darkness. You're like, you're riding a train at night and being like, is it the morning?
I remember crossing the bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan in the pitch black of darkness at 5:30 or 6 in the morning to get to classes that started at 8.
Yep.
And yeah, being in, actually I remember being in Manhattan when it was dark, and I was like, this is some Gotham City shit to be in the dark Manhattan before. But you know what? There's tons of people around.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of people on the train, and I think we all have one thing in common, which is we wouldn't be doing this unless we were getting some money for it.
Yeah. Well, isn't that the story of New York, right? Since the pandemic is a slowdown in that world, that 9 to 5 drive. Like, I think the apex of that, it's like the movie Working Girl with Melanie Griffith. And it's like the image of like all these women who are wearing, the opening sequence is like women crossing on the Staten Island ferry to come into Manhattan and work in like finance offices in lower Manhattan. And the women all are like secretaries, and some of them are like bosses and stuff like that. But they're wearing like sneakers as they commute. And then when they get to their jobs, they like put on high heels. And that little detail on like all the like waves of people coming off the ferry. It's It's like that commute in New York in the 80s feels like the apex of that whole phenomenon.
The opening to Devil Wears Prada is
Yes.
riffing on that, I think.
Yep.
And it also makes me think, hey, given our business here today, the person I had in mind was Howard Zinn, fellow New Yorker, but from Brooklyn, I believe, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
I think so.
But the other guy we're talking about today is another New Yorker, but not someone who was going to put on some high-heeled shoes on his way to the office.
Right. But a working class guy nonetheless.
Yeah.
So we're talking about George Carlin today. It's kind of amazing, actually. I was thinking, have we talked about, and Claudia mentioned this too. She's like, hey, you haven't done a George Carlin show with Justin before? And I was like, no, it's weird. I looked it up. We did. George Carlin did come up on the show a couple years ago when talking with Carrie Connors, who is a colleague of yours at LaGuardia Community College.
Yeah.
We talked about her book Laugh Lines, which is all about political critique and in comedy and poetry, actually. And so Carlin obviously came up with his whole like 7 dirty words thing and everything. But yeah, George Carlin is kind. It's funny that you mentioned Howard Zinn, because like there is a sort of like archetype of this sort of like New York working class guy of like that generation, the like 20th century, the sort of World War II Vietnam generation, that sort of goes in a sort of social critique left wing direction. The guy I'm thinking of too is Howard Levy. I don't know if you remember me talking about him, but he was a doctor who I went and interviewed for the book. Living in Brooklyn, he was the guy who was one of the first people in the U.S. Army to refuse service around the Vietnam War and go to prison for it. And when I went and talked to him in like 2009, he's this total George Carlin type guy. Let me tell you what happened in the Vietnam War. Like he had that kind of affect and accent, and Carlin embodies that. And it seems like a key part of his personality, but there's a lot to talk about with George Carlin, and he seems like a very nostalgia trap type figure because he straddles a lot of different worlds, counterculture and stand-up comedy in Hollywood, but also this sort of like acid critique. And I mean that literally with LSD, but also just a kind of biting satirical thing. He's a comedy god, I think, for a lot of people, the real deal. Do you remember the first time, Justin, that you encountered George Carlin's material?
Honestly, it would have been later Carlin. So, I'm born 1980. So we didn't have HBO, and so
yeah, me neither.
If I encountered him, it probably was through like television clips that were sanitized for TV. But he found his way in, I know, through wasn't he in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure?
That's right.
That was probably my first encounter with him. And I didn't know him as a comedian. I just knew him as like here's a charismatic, like wise dude. And then I saw him again in Dogma. And I picked him up as a teenager as this kind of cultural liberal elder figure who called bullshit on a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm,
and he always came across as a very kind of secular dude, a guy who was like fiercely profane, but also kind of calm, edgy, full of wisdom, sort of grandfatherly. And so one of the trips of preparing for this show was realizing, dude, this guy had like 3 or 4 lives before that instantiation of himself.
Yes.
And he's like known, even known to himself as a guy with like multiple characters inside of him. But the characters are from like 30s, 40s, what the book calls white Harlem, or like upper West Side Manhattan.
Yeah.
And he ran around with like these, I don't know how to say it, like these Irish thugs who just rolled through the streets beating the shit out of Columbia students. And that was the milieu that I associate a little bit with Zinn, and to a lesser extent Chomsky when he came up from Philly. And he was just younger than Zinn, so that when Zinn is dropping bombs in France, like Carlin's not yet eligible to serve, but he later goes into the Air Force and is even stationed abroad and is discharged from the Air Force. But all those little overlapping aspects were there, in addition to like this whole like deep personal history. Because if I thought Carlin was kind of like this hippie guy, he wasn't always that way.
Right. I mean, that's, it reminds me of figures like Neil Young. And I always find a way to talk about Neil Young, I know, but like I first encountered Neil Young in the 90s version, which was kind of when he was going through like grunge and was kind of the godfather of grunge. And he was associated with like Eddie Vedder, playing with Pearl Jam. I mean, honestly, like the Keep on Rockin' in the Free World performance at like one of the MTV Awards with Pearl Jam was like
Tyler Gentler Machine Gun Man.
Exactly. And Eddie Vedder changes the lyric to a kinder, gentler policeman's hand, which I love too. Kind of the same effect. But either way, that moment, introduced Neil Young to me, and I was kind of like, who is this like old, scary, like drugged out dude, like shredding the electric guitar like a maniac? And I also knew that like Eddie Vedder and all these guys that I respected that were younger respected him a lot. So I was kind of like, oh, who's this guy? But I didn't realize that there was this long history, and Neil Young had lived like a million lives and really changed as a performer and all those things I came to appreciate later. Carlin is like that too, because there was kind of a 90s grungy hippie thing going on in the 90s, as you and I have talked about many times. And Carlin kind of fit in there in a weird way as like an elder statesman of the counterculture, the American counterculture. And I probably encountered him in the same places you did, like Dogma, the Kevin Smith movie, which I haven't seen in a long time. That'd be a weird one to watch. It's a Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, right? Are in that?
Kevin Smith, right?
Yeah. Oh, not a fan. But that's another show. Either way, Carlin was sort of there in the 90s with the hip kids in a way. And I didn't realize until I went to, it's funny because it's kind of weirdly like 60s moment, but it was in like in the probably year 2000, somewhere in there. I went to a friend's house who like pulled out his dad's record collection and was like, listen to these Carlin records. And it was like so profane and so crazy. And it was like his stuff from the 70s where after he'd done acid and he was like talking about weird shit, but also like it was I don't know, it was an education in the same way that when a girlfriend made me listen to the Beatles, and I mean really listen to the Beatles for the first time. I'd heard all the kind of poppy stuff, but I'd never heard like Sgt. Pepper's and the trippy day in your life stuff. And it was just such a connection. It's like, oh, that's what the previous generation was talking about. And it feels like Carlin fits in there because he was a big figure in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. And, the thing that kept coming out to me was that the analog distribution channels, the pre-digital distribution channels, were sort of key to sustaining Carlin's career, and his career evolved alongside the evolution of these channels. And one of the things that I kind of picked up on when you mentioned the vinyl was how important those sales were to his career, but also to the transformation of like comedy's role in the culture. And it was when to my knowledge, based on this book, the vinyl started in the 60s, but it was when you started to win Grammys. His first Grammy was for a vinyl record, a comedy record,
right?
In I think the mid 70s. When that happened, they were giving Grammys, which we consider like a musical award. They're giving Grammys to comedians, best comedy album, best comedy record, whatever it's called. And at that point,
it's like it became an art form, like a legitimate art form. Yeah.
Yeah. It became kind of his own version of Sgt. Pepper. His, AM, FM, or FM and AM was for him his Sgt. Pepper. And the title was interesting too. And I know that you're more compelling about this than I am, but that move from FM to AM radio or AM to FM radio, whichever the move was, one of them was more corporate and the other one was more cable TV, like, user generated cable television. Mm-hmm. There was like a different culture to the frequency. Oh, that's such a weird phrase to say. And that you can see that the transformations in analog technology, I believe, are actually moving us closer and closer to what would become mimetic digital culture, and especially social media. And there's a couple of things that I picked up on at one point. If you wanted me to share one of them.
Yeah, because this picks up on a really interesting thread of Carlin's career, which is that he's kind of a self-made entrepreneur type guy too, right? And he's like intervening in the world in a way to like make his brand, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and spot on page 236 of Last Words, the memoir we looked at for today. He writes, and this is later in his career, but this is pre-social media. He writes, the noisier the culture becomes, the stronger your voice has to be heard above the din. how is he not writing about Twitter? You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like, that's
right.
amazing as a line for analog culture. So you can see that whatever disruptions, both for the better and for the worse, that we associate with social media, we're alive, we're alert in analog culture. And then a few pages later, and this is it for this particular theme, but I was provoked by it. On the same kind of wavelength, he says, the reason I prefer the sledgehammer to the rapier, and the reason I believe in blunt, violent, confrontational forms for the presentation of my ideas is because I see that what's happening to the lives of people is not rapier-like, it is not gentle, it is not subtle, it is direct, hard, and violent.
Ooh.
How is that not also about Trump? You know what I mean? Like, that's an amazing fucking line. That it's that line is prophetic for so much of social media. And I believe that with that, you could also read it backwards, and you start to realize the germs of what we associate with a digital culture were evolving throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s through vinyl, through AM or FM, through HBO.
It's also so keyed into Carlin's whole obsession with language and what language does. I mean, I hear like a political sort of, I mean, the roots of the political rebellion is in what he's saying there, because he's like, I'm not going to use soft language to whitewash the situation. I'm actually going to go the other way and use the most extreme, corrosive, violent language to describe accurately what I see. And it's interesting because, so much of what stand-up comedy is, he's in a lot of ways, he's one of the key figures in making stand-up comedy into something that people regard as quote unquote capital I important, right? Which is interesting. We're always kind of like, what? That's so weird that like we have these figures that tell jokes about like all sorts of things, and yet we also take them seriously as like social commentary, and as sometimes even political figures in some weird way. That like Trump is a stand-up comic, and people have made that connection a lot, right?
Yeah.
So like the only other time you really see like one person on a stage telling you what to think, it's like either a politician or a stand-up comic. That's like profound. That means we've elevated the stand-up comic to like this really powerful place in the culture and even the politics. And Carlin is a key figure in all that. And there's kind of an irony to it because he's like playing the game at the same time he's kind of positioning himself as outside of the game in some ways, especially in his later material when he kind of just decimates the whole human race.
Well, we'll get to that at some point, but I just want to agree with you. And, and there's, how do I say this? He has a lot in common with the sort of figures that you just invoked, which in addition to Trump, you could actually argue Clinton, Obama, and George W. Bush all had elements of stand-up comedy to their like political campaign and their speechifying discourse.
Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, Reagan too, which is a key figure for Carlin, way more than Nixon, which is interesting given his age and his so-called generation. And one of the things that I picked up on too, in terms of what you're saying, in terms of his influence and his like way with words, it kind of reminded me of you. So like, I mean this as a compliment, but when I got done with this book and when I see some of his stand-up and when I compare it to what I experienced when I re-listen to our shows, which oftentimes when you're talking to me, I'm hearing you and picking up on what I need to say, but I can't actually fully appreciate what you've said in total until I re-listen to it again. But you have a very similar talent to Carlin, I think, because you are able to distill what's important about something in a way that's both intellectually accurate, but also emotionally fair. And so you're able to, you share a similar sensibility to Carlin.
That's way too high a compliment, but thank you. Well, but I will say that it's because of, I've been reading his book. I'm like, dude, I feel like this guy. Right. I've always, and finding Carlin was kind of like finding, I think this is true for a lot of people. It's like finding a comrade, just sort of like, oh, this guy's like me. And I mean, there are times when you see the clips on YouTube that have become like viral clips that have like 50 million views. And the crowd's reaction to where he's just kind of like really attacking like the American dream and like all these like really bedrock concepts, the crowd just going nuts. And it's so, in other words, it seems like there's an influence in his perspective, and he definitely had an influence on me in how I see the world. It's fucked up because he's a comedian and he's doing it as partly as a thought experiment. But the other part of it is like, if you read the memoir, he really buys a lot of this. This is like, we're getting Carlin's real perspective in a lot of ways, although couched in just jokes. And I think that's the other thing I want to mention before I go is that political humor is tricky, and being like a political guy that's doing your politics, Carlin is really, really funny. And like, that's part of the key thing is that I'm laughing from the beginning to the end. This guy really, his something about his brutality and the language is key to it, and his attitude, but he's really funny. And that's a key part of like being a stand-up. There are some stand-ups now that really lean hard on the kind of like political sort of take they have. And I'm like, where's the joke? Like, I don't hear like quite the craft of like making me laugh that I heard with Carlin. And I think it's a rare talent for sure.
Well, and I think like many of us, but I know we've had these conversations, going back to what you said a moment earlier, Carlin was also super self-conscious about his 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the whole American success, American dream thing. So when he shits on it, he's very self-conscious throughout the memoir to also say he always desired it too. And so it's interesting to see that from a very personal place. It's not just an intellectual critique. He's angry at the thing that he wants, which to me is an epic nostalgia trap analysis.
As a resentment.
And,
yeah.
Like desiring the thing that's fucking you is like one of our main messages from all these years of conversation. So I think nostalgia trap is it's like a weird, great bastard child of George Carlin in a
totally
weird way.
Yeah, that's why it's weird that we haven't talked about him directly before.
It is
because he seems like he was doing nostalgia trap, even in the sense of like the whole indie nature of the project. I mean, of course he's a big famous figure and he has a star in the Hollywood Walk of Fame and all that kind of thing, but he still feels like a little bit of an outsider. And from his perspective, he really felt like he never really became part of the club. And that you can hear that. That's one of his most famous bits, his later bits, is that like, it's a big club and you ain't in it. Like that, it feels like he's talking about himself there too. Like, I'm not in the social part of being wealthy and powerful. And I kind of want that, even though I know it's like those people are fucking reptiles. It's such a weird, that's a trap. The desire for it is a trap. And I think even the most hardened leftist is partly like, I want to be in that room too, even if they won't admit it.
Fighting words. I love it. Well, another trap discourse that we've long held on the show, I discovered, and I was like, man, I wonder if this is partly where it originates. And it's early in his life. It's pre-acid, pre-69, old school Carlin, Zinn-ish era Carlin in the Air Force. And as he's describing like those Air Force years, he kind of has a framing chapter around it, which is unusual for the memoir once you finish it. And he writes, weird how the military touches so many aspects of your life. It's like the church in that way. You hate it, but it forms you, which is like, we got to take that into every show. You hate it, but it forms you. It's a parent, mother church, and father military. I was like, oh, David's daddy. So listen to this description, which we've used to twist into so many different scenarios.
Mother church, father military.
Yeah, and he goes on and he goes, father, in quotes. Father might seem a bit affectionate for someone who's on record more than once as having no respect for the business of war. But I don't feel about war the way we're supposed to, the way we're told to by the United States government, a large part of which is the United States military, whose business is war. So the military is telling us how to feel about war so they can stay in business. Something is fucked up here. And then listen to how he continues. This is, but I confess, Father, to being conflicted about the military. I was 4 when we got into World War II. Its memory is precious to me, a central fact of my young life. The slogans, the uniforms, the newscasts, the songs, the white cliffs of Dover, don't sit under the apple tree, I'll never smile again. I can never hear them without being overwhelmed by nostalgia. Weirdly enough, the songs of war make me feel safe.
Oof.
That's tremendous trap right there.
Didn't we say there would be pandemic nostalgia, like lockdown nostalgia? You know, the kind of like it's when we had a common purpose, we were together. It totally makes sense to me. Pete Hamill, he recently died. A Brooklyn writer. He wrote for like the New York Post in the 60s and 70s. He's a famous guy, and he wrote a lot of memoirs and novels and things like that. But he has a memoir called The Drinking Life. It's a great book, honestly, about Brooklyn, growing up in Brooklyn during World War II. And he has that same sort of weird nostalgia for the times when Manhattan went dark because they were afraid of bombing. So that it went dark for like a year or something like that. Every night there was no lights on in Brooklyn or Manhattan. And when the lights came back on because the war was over and all the old ladies coming out and crying together and hugging in the streets and stuff, he describes that as like, this was the apex of my sort of nostalgic life to this day is the kind of the feeling that we had together experiencing war from Brooklyn, you know. And yeah, there's something weird about that. I did want to, you know, that trap part of it, that contradiction. I have a short bit I want to read from the same book. This is a Carlin's memoir. If you didn't catch what Justin said, it's called Last Words. He wrote a couple different books, I think, but this is the sort of story of the life. But I thought this was very nostalgia trap as well, because, you know, part of what we talk about on this show is sort of like, I don't know, how you come to your political ideas or your ideas about the world and stuff like that. At some point, he like decided to try and educate himself out of feeling like he didn't know what was going on. He reached a point in his political comedy in like the 80s or his comedy, his stand-up comedy career, where he was frustrated with himself even because he was just talking about like boogers and farts and like juvenile shit. He's like, I didn't even know.
Observational humor.
Yeah. He's like, I didn't even know what I was doing anymore. Doing a bunch of like dog jokes, like just stupid shit. And I felt lost.
What's
and like,
the deal with dogs?
Yeah. Those are weird, right? Yeah, and SNL was edgy, you know, at the time, and he's like, "Who the fuck am I?" So he wants to educate himself, and this was very nostalgia trap to me. He says, "I began to do something about my political ignorance. I subscribed to publications like Anarchy Magazine, Mother Jones, In These Times, The Nation. I read a lot of sociology and social history. I sought out the most radical parts of the Village Voice, which I'd always kept a subscription to because I liked the New York edge. I knew I'd always find someone really far left, not just Village Voice left, but someone really wailing, like Alexander Cockburn. I discovered Noam Chomsky, Hunter Thompson, Gore Vidal, writers who said things in a daring manner, truly dissenting voices. I had a left-wing humanitarian, secular humanist, liberal inclination on the one hand, which implied positions on myriad issues. On the other, I had prejudices and angers and hatreds towards various classes of people, none of which included skin color or ethnicity or religion. Well, religion, yes. I used to get angry at blue-collar right-wingers, but that passed because I saw that in the end, they were just a different sort of victim. I felt discomfort at having received positions on issues simply because of my preference for the left of center, for people's rights over property rights. I was beginning to find that a lot of my positions clashed. The habits of liberals, their automatic language, their knee-jerk responses to certain issues deserve the epithets the right wing stuck with them. I'd see how true they often were. Here they were, banding together in packs so that I could predict what they were going to say about some event or conflict, and it wasn't even out of their mouths yet. I was very uncomfortable with that. Liberal orthodoxy was as repugnant to me as conservative orthodoxy. So I thought I was reading that and I was like, you know, that's very identifiable in a lot of ways, you know, sort of like hating the right wing, rolling your eyes at how cynical and desperate their politics are, and at the same time being like, well, a lot of what they're saying about liberals, I kind of understand, you know, I understand that sort of revulsion at some of the orthodoxies on that side as well. So I don't know. It seems like a common position, honestly, maybe a populist one. What do you think of the politics there?
Well, it's interesting in light of the legacy that when you hear someone who's kind of invoking a very specific left tradition, you know, nation, Mother Jones, Chomsky, Hunter Thompson, etc., that they're invoking something that isn't necessarily as common today. Like if you look at the really political comedians of the moment, they tread pretty far to the right on certain issues. And I don't just mean a general distaste for dogmatic language, which I think all of us kind of resent on some level. We a lot of human beings just resent being told what to think by people outside who they perceive to be their group that they affiliate with. That's just like true for humans. They just don't like being told what's proper to say. In fact, it's really weird that from that Catholic upbringing perspective, one that I actually know pretty well myself, when you forbid someone from using a word, or when you tell them that something is shameful, you create it as a taboo that then becomes an object of desire and becomes an object of wish fulfillment. And that's puzzling, because that means that if you are trying to control people or influence people, the last thing you want to do is tell them that they can't do something. And so even
that
for
seems
people
like
who
just basic psychology, right? And
right.
it's like I'm hearing that, I'm like, yeah, of course. You tell me not to do something, I'm going to want to do that more.
Yeah.
And yet there's still a strong authoritarian impulse in politics, obviously.
Yeah. And a lot of it, I sympathize for the people that do just want people to be nice. Just be nice and use this word.
Sure.
I understand that. There's a part of me that likes the civility and politeness of it, but as a political paradigm, it's all I would say is I think it's notably ineffective. And in that Foucauldian contradictionary sense, it breeds the very thing you're trying to get rid of. It actually keeps it living. So the point is kind of taken there. What I would say, though, is when you look to the words that the campus language police were probably policing in the 80s and 90s, it sounds to me like a lot of earnest identity politics people. And so even though a part of me is totally with Carlin on it, part of me is kind of like, well, like we could just be more civil, folks.
Yeah, I've always been that way. And when I hear we were saying honestly with because stand-up comedy is still the hot site for the debate of all these issues. Honestly, it's the testing ground for a lot of this shit. And we were, before we started this, you and I were texting like, oh, who's the modern Carlin? There's no one really quite like him. But I just threw out the name Dave Chappelle just because he seems like he's a challenging comic and at a high level, and someone who is a lightning rod. I mean, he's sort of like a Richard Pryor, honestly, more than George Carlin in some ways, especially in terms of his just sort of really intense and rough attitudes. But yeah, there's a lot of Chappelle shit that's just like, going after cancel culture or trans people or whatever that I'm just not on board with, even though I can sort of understand the kind of philosophical place that he's coming from sometimes. I just don't. I think part of it is that I don't like bullies. It's that old bully thing. It's that old, like, if someone's saying, I don't like being called this, and you're just going to be the person that stands up and says it anyway, because you're invested in your freedom so much that you want to hurt other people with your language. I don't know. I just think that's an asshole. And I can't maybe get around it philosophically because, yeah, people can say what they want, but there are consequences. And I don't know. It's just like, don't be an asshole.
Yeah. I'd also say that, like, in the realm, this is all fraught territory where a lot of people listening to this probably have smarter things to say about it than me. But within this fraught territory, I'd also say that it's a trap of its own.
Yeah.
Because you get stuck playing representational politics with super earnest people and super fucking like profane people. And like at the end of the day, I don't know how much time we want to spend or how much time we have to spend just being language police officers on either side or all the sides. And then when you go back to Carlin's, note,
and you see how cynically it's weaponized too, and how disingenuous it is often.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like if you can,
if
you can point and say shame based on a word, that's your in to like be able to dominate in all sorts of different ways. And I think people resist that and see the cynicism of it as well. It's really complicated territory. But Carlin's whole thing is, his book is called Last Words, right? Words are everything to him, and his most famous thing is probably the 7 dirty words bit, which was about censorship, which I guess is what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's actually, I'll pause what I was going to say because I want to get onto the 7 dirty words, which I think is interesting in part because it happens before his Reagan era political study. And it takes us back to a moment, I believe, in like the early 70s that had been building from the early 60s. One thing that's of note is that Carlin was there that night when Lenny Bruce in 62 was arrested for obscenity. And him and Bruce had an interesting relationship, as well as Bruce's relationship with his wife, Brenda. I thought that was an interesting little triangle. And one of the things that kind of caught my attention from like a literary point of view was just how much those censorship battles in the 60s and the early 70s were such an important part of opening up the theater of social media that we understand today and take for granted. Because if you think that the social media companies, being protected by the 96 Communications Act, section, what is it, 200A, whatever the 96 Decency Act was all about, where they're not responsible for what's posted on the platforms, what a ways we have come. That was passed in 96.
Oh, yeah.
Considering that in the 60s, if you're Carlin and you're on stage in Milwaukee in 69 or early 70s, you're getting arrested for saying certain words out in public at a comedy show. And he was arrested in Milwaukee. And it's kind of remarkable how much the police were involved.
The literal police
people for saying shit, fucking cunt. That's
this
kind
is Jim
of amazing.
Morrison too, right?
It's not that long ago. And one of the things I thought was a treat to read about was that after that Milwaukee arrest, it goes through appeals and shit, and it goes to the Supreme Court. I cannot believe that I've gone my whole life and never understood that Carlin's arrest led to a Supreme Court decision, FCC versus Pacifica Foundation, which actually was a follow-up to the Milwaukee arrest, which was dismissed. He read out some things on the radio, and that's what led to the arrest. He had these problems with the Cardinals back in the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And the Supreme Court decision, when he writes about it, it's actually on 171. And it's just worth mentioning, given the kind of politics that are in play here. And it says, a New York man said a subsequent U.S. Supreme Court summary who, while driving with his young son, and it's like this total thing from today where a right-winger sued the radio station for breaching FCC rules because his son was in the car and overheard these words. And
these are the subject of so many movies, these censorship battles, I feel like. It's like the loosening of the culture around language. Yeah.
Yeah. And in 78, the LA Times headline is "Court Bans 7 Dirty Words." And the justice who's like writing for the majority is John Paul Stevens writing against Carlin. And I'll spare you his reasoning. Anyone can go and find it, but it's kind of hilarious and sounds to the right of John Roberts. It sounds like Gorsuch. Like it's really right-wing interpretation. And to my knowledge, Stevens is considered a liberal court justice, especially by today's standards, like a far left court justice. So it tells you a lot about the norms of society back in the day. And I think
it's also it confuses the issue in a lot of ways to me about like what a libertarian is, what a conservative is, and who are the language police, because it's like there's a left-wing language police and there's a like it's weird to think of cancel culture as coming from one side because everybody's canceling each other here.
Absolutely.
But I think movies like even on Back to the Future, like those movies about the 50s, like Pleasantville was one of them, where it was like there were like these mean conservative guys who were trying to stop the girls from dancing and like, all that kind of like conservative puritanical culture that was identified as the bad guys controlling language and things like that. But it's like there's also, I don't know, Carlin fits in there with these sort of rebels that were the pioneers of breaking down those barriers. He fits in with like Larry Flynt, which there was of course, People versus Larry Flynt, what Hustler magazine published. They published a full-page parody ad against televangelist and political commentator Jerry Falwell, depicting him as an incestuous drunk who had sex with his mother in an outhouse, and which is hilarious. But of course, Falwell sued and said, "You can't say that about me. That is, a violation of all these different statutes and laws protecting me from slander and things like that." But the Supreme Court famously ruled that the parody of a public figure was totally legitimate free speech. I feel like Carlin is in there as well. Howard Stern in the 90s. Do you remember? I mean, that movie, Private Parts, is
Yeah.
entirely about him like pushing the edge of what could be said on FM radio. And it was all language and words, and it had to do with sex and drugs and rock and roll. I mean, counterculture type shit. It feels like Howard Stern carried that. I'm just thinking about, like, I don't know, the different political traditions, because Stern ends up being like this today, this kind of like bleeding heart liberal guy who interviews old rock stars like Bruce Springsteen and stuff like that. Very different than the image I had of him in the 90s as this like iconoclastic rebel who was like really interested in saying nasty shit. He's not like that at all anymore. And it kind of reveals sort of the political position, I think, in some ways, because there's contradictions in all of it in terms of, the libertarian element we're talking about here, because, you think of conservatives as wanting to control language, but then the libertarians as the ones that are sort of like the rockers that are going to break all those barriers. But they're all kind of in the Republican Party, is what I'm saying.
But, going back to the other point you made, it's also true that anyone with power is trying to control language, because if you can control language, you stabilize your power. What you call someone, what you call a problem, what you call a thing is essential, and therefore everyone's involved in policing other people's language. Everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that seems to be one of the main functions of social media. And look at the arguments we've seen play out in the last 3 weeks, but we can say our whole lives. What you name something as is an intense site of debate and struggle, and that's kind of as it should be, because there is no, I think, well,
what is a terrorist?
Yeah,
what is genocide?
Yeah.
What is a freedom fighter? What is a settler? Yeah, those right. are. Who is a civilian?
Right. Struggles for power will involve struggles for language. And so in some sense, even to a curmudgeon like myself, who often thinks that the sphere of representational war is a distraction from, material wars and material struggles, I could take a hint here. And when you go back to something else you said about Stern, it matches the 7 words you can't say on television, which are almost all about sex and gender. And I think that represents still like the dark door that even Carlin couldn't quite always get past, but I appreciated him like walking right up into it, because he frequently could treat every subject with the profanity that it deserved, including himself. Which I give him credit for. And when he does finally address gender in a few different places, I think it's worth tracing into basically what we said we would get to earlier, which is like this end Carlin, late Carlin, which is like the kind of apocalyptic Carlin, kind of, I wouldn't say nihilist, but maybe cynical or transcendent or even post-human, whatever you want to say.
Misanthropic for sure. Yeah.
And I think you can see it from the beginning, but, I just want to tag one thing here, which is back in that The Military Is My Daddy chapter, he ends with a critique of institutional politics wrapped up in gender identity that I think works not only well for the U.S. military, but I think it works pretty well for what we understand about state communism. And he writes, in a way, the Air Force was the father I never had, and just replace Air Force with party. In a way, the party was the father I never had. It was an all-male entity that took care of me. Are we talking about the USSR? Are we talking about the Chinese Communist Party here? What are we talking about? Gave me a room of my own, fed me, and helped me get the childhood part of me finished. It brought me to a place where I could step off into my life and career, and rejected me at just the right moment. So it's like, this is a guy who was like a Communist Party USSR guy who then became like a Václav Havel Eastern European freedom dude, But anyway, I'll keep going. So he continues. So I want to thank the Pentagon, the Soviet Union, and the military industrial complex from the bottom of my heart. Without them, I could never have become the man I am today. That's only half sarcastic. And to me, that is a key node in like the Carlin thread here. And later, when he gets into exploding the cliches, notice that the groups he's talking about, it's hard to understand where gender as a category fits in, but it's really easy to understand where parties and ideologies fit in. And so I want to get into this because I think this is also part of the trap legacy. he says something like later in the book on 272, he says, a big part of my job is exploding cliches. I think that's key because another word for cliche is contradiction. And one of the things we often say is like the site of contradiction is actually the site where the work needs to get done. And that the contradiction is often not the slogan.
Right.
Or
right.
Or part of the messiness of what we're trying to do here is to make the slogan into a contradiction, which pisses a lot of people off. And then later in the book,
change
actually,
you
a lot
can
of people
believe in.
Yeah. It doesn't piss a lot of people off. It pisses off one person, you know. So like, sorry, that's a little too inflating there. But later on, in the same kind of concluding passages, he says, he makes these lists of people that he fucking hates, kind of a thing. And he says, one of my lists once was people I can do without. Near the top, people who say, long live such and such, and then kill someone to accomplish it. That's not, again, like the earlier passage, that's not just a critique of military-industrial complex. That's a critique of parties. That's a critique of states. And that's a critique of tankies. You know what I mean? Like, that's a critique of a lot of people that are willing to kill in the name of an idea without much fucking thought or trouble to their conscience. And then he continues, and I think this is the libertarian horizon that we've been invoking, and especially you've been invoking this conversation. And it's pure Carlin, but I think it's invoking a trap that I know that we've acknowledged again and again. Not to say that we're on the same way, not to say we're 100% aligned, but here's what he says. The larger the group, the more toxic. The more of your beauty as an individual you have to surrender for the sake of group thought. Now, again, anti-state, anti-party, anti-tanky, in some ways, in terms of the Cold War, anti-communist, you know, not in the way that we might understand the term. And he continues, and when you suspend your individual beauty, you also give up a lot of your humanity and then drop down. It happens in police culture. Now, you could read, he means it specifically, but we should read it theoretically. And he says, you get to talking with individual cops, and they're the greatest fucking guys in the world. But you know that when they're making a domestic disturbance call in the black section of town, they're going to hit first and ask questions later. And then finally drop down again. He goes, do I value the flag? No, of course not. Do I value words on a piece of paper? Depends whose words they are. Do I believe in family values? Depends on whose family. That's classic Carlin, and I think we get a lot of that. And the flagship is out of Baldwin too, but you can hear this profound distrust with what he calls groups, but which we could call parties. This profound, we could call states. You know, we could call mass movements. He gets that because on some level, what he's really troubled by, and later he calls himself essentially an anarchist, like in a kind of a fuzzy way, but that's what he says. What he kind of hits on is he's very, very concerned by how individuals, we could substitute human rights here, but individuals are fucking murdered in collectives. And you can apply that not just to saying like, whoa, Carlin was a closet anti-communist. You can go further than that and say, actually, Carlin was anti-state, and he was kind of a small d socialist Democrat at bottom, if you take him at his word. Here's the final thing that I wanted to riff on, because again, we're in that trap territory. And he says, I don't think the world is that neat. None of us is that neat. None of us falls into categories. There are differing aspects of ourselves, not all of which point in the same direction. I'm a collection of liberal, conservative, and anarchist. Different parts of me emerge when I'm outside my common mode, permissive left liberal. I'll stop there. You can hear where he's going with that. And then you apply that to all the characters that he has in his heads, the Broadway show that he wanted to do, New York Boy, that he never got a chance to do. But you can hear a lot of that fucking skepticism towards the same kinds of groupthink that I think we are often skeptical towards. And you also have to treat it as, well, look, if you go off on your own, it's lonely, it's alienating, you often lack support, it can be unhealthy, it can be a free fall. You can get lost out there separate from everybody else too. You know, I'm not trying to just privilege it.
And isn't it in conflict with the very idea of creating a harmonious experience of living with billions of people on the planet Earth? You know, it's really, that part of it is really tricky. And I think that he had to go all the way. And I think that in a lot of ways, his desire to go all the way with his sort of like remove from the human race in that way was was both an intellectual project and a response to his own disappointments with what he saw. And there's a clip from Jon Stewart that you sent me, who is someone who's very deeply influenced by George Carlin, I think, obviously, especially in his like political commentary. But he brings up that story of like, you know, like, oh, people say that he lost his faith, he lost his hope, he became cynical and nihilistic. But Stewart casts it as like, well, that was just partly Carlin's disappointment in how things went and how the historical moment that he occupied and what he saw as the human race falling apart. He, you know, in those passages, I read them too. I like those last passages where he's sort of positioning himself. He also Carlin recognizes the irony of the fact that he makes his living by getting groups together to laugh together, right? Like there's like he still like depends on that group project. It's hard because I saw this clip, and maybe it's one you sent, where he's talking to Charlie Rose, and he says, I completely divested myself from any emotional attachment to the outcome. And Charlie Rose is like, what do you mean? He's like, I don't care what happens. I don't have an investment in the story of humanity. And that's partly an intellectual position, but it's also just who I am. Like it's how I see things is a part. And like, it's funny because that I think that in that way, he's not a left-wing figure in a lot of ways, because the left is so concerned with like creating a group, you know, and creating a coherent political group. And that's what the project is ostensibly. And Carlin is kind of like Bob Dylan in that way, I feel like, where it's like people read him as a left-wing figure and they want him to be that. But as I think it's Joan Baez who says it in the Scorsese documentary about Bob Dylan. She says, people expected Dylan to show up at all these like anti-war rallies or like peace stuff. He didn't give a shit, and he didn't show up to those things. And it was in part because he didn't want to participate in that kind of group thing. Part of me sees that as just a kind of curmudgeon figure. That's just, but the other part of me is like kind of recognizes my own sort of attitudes towards the group. And I feel a lot of the same ways as Carlin does. And I think that a lot of other people must too. And that's a secret to his popularity.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's something I struggle with myself because, I mean, dead alien is a method, but you can't become it. And in some of his stand-up, it sounds like Carlin is the dead alien. Like he's transcended, but he's not coming back. And I also don't know if you can, I don't know that that's a politics. I mean, it is a politics.
Is there something, do you think that, I mean, is there something arrogant and gross about it too? Like we've talked about figures like this, who like intellectuals who sort of remove themselves from anything and remove themselves from any responsibility to anybody else. And are just sort of like, I see it all because I'm the wizard, you know, from space. I don't know. I see why people would react to it that way.
I think for some people, not all, it is a function of privilege. He got very wealthy late in life. You know, he found a lot of success in the 80s. He was able to pay off some of those delinquent tax things that were happening in the 70s. And he got much better management, got much better with money, and eventually got clean. And
was
just a lot more responsible. I don't know if I know, you know, he was a lot more responsible with money.
He had an accountant, is what you're saying.
You know, I think it's also like what you said there is you gotta go dead alien on the dead alien. And, you know, this is a guy whose contradictions are worth exploring too, not simply because we need to hold him or Dylan on the Mount Rushmore of the cultural left, but mainly because each of these lives that we examine has so much to teach us, both in terms of, you know, where people admit to feeling stuck and also to where we see they're getting stuck, and partly for the reasons you described, which is that we can relate to it. I think I don't know if I want to say this generationally, but from a historical perspective, one of the things that caught my attention because it overlapped some of what Baldwin has written about is what did Carlin make of the late 60s assassinations or the mid 60s assassinations? What happened there? And I want to connect it to one of the places that he ends up, because I think that these show off the fact that you can't ever quite take any one of his bits at his word, because there is an element of performance that will undo what you think is a fixed sense.
Mm-hmm.
And he writes, I didn't respond with rage to any of what was happening in 1968. Dr. King's murder in April was depressingly predictable. There was a sinking feeling that something good was ebbing away and being encouraged in that direction by the usual forces. The establishment was winning its war, its assassins, its secret government. And that fact overpowered and debilitated me more than it enraged me. That's a man who might be admitting to us there that something broke in him and that the place he went at the end might not have been by choice. He might have been a little bit broke. And, I think it's, when you go back to the late Carlin, and he's already into climate change and global warming and all that shit. And you see that he's one of the, like, kind of with some of his abortion material, it's hard to separate. Like, was he the first one to say these things because they become a version of the common sense in certain threads? But, he says, the planet will shuck us off like a case of the crabs. Forget about saving endangered species. We are the endangered species. I hear that all the time now, but I'm wondering, like, when he was saying that back in the late 90s and shit, were other people already saying that? That's a rhetorical point.
In fact, that makes me remember that one of his environmentalist bits about, he was like, fuck environmentalism. And I was like, what? I thought this guy was like a hippie. I thought he was a left winger. And then he explains that, like, the earth has survived a lot of bullshit for billions of years. It'll survive human beings. We're the endangered species. That was a mind fuck of a moment for me, and a delivery of exactly what Carlin wanted, to sort of like show up in the mainstream on your comedy channel and say something so fucked up that it made me think in ways that I never had before, because I'd never encountered that position. I only encountered that we need to save the planet or fuck the planet, but I'd never heard that we're the endangered species and the earth will survive us and that sort of thing. That it really was a lot to take on. And I thank Carlin for that. And I think that's what he wanted to do.
Yeah. And he's staking out these positions that also, like, thoughts like that, they're not complete thoughts, but they sound like tweets. And I think that, again, that's where you see
the endangered species. Yeah.
Comedy is a predecessor. Comedy club and stand-up comedy is a predecessor to social media. And this comedians are a predecessor to what we now understand to be influencers, or at least some of those influencers.
Yeah. And memes and everything else.
And to the people and to us who would say, like, dude, that's not really that fucking funny. Like, if it's funny, it's so fucking dark. One of the things that also caught my attention, and it reflects on something you said earlier, is he writes, laughter is not the only proof of success. Boy, what a liberating recognition that was. It grew and grew during those months of testing and practice on the road. And when I got to the Felt Forum, the sheer number of people ensured that even during those quiet moments, there was an audible appreciation going on. Not laughs, but some ripple of agreement, a collective, oh yeah, pleasure in sheer ideas. With smaller audiences, I hadn't heard reactions like that because they were less inclined to expose themselves. But here, lost in a sea of people, they let themselves go. Isn't he also describing podcasting there? You know what I mean? Like, you can see in these different venues a real space that was a predecessor to digital.
Totally. And the kind of the political rant, the Rush Limbaugh, even on the microphone, what we're doing right now, you're looking for that. Yeah. You're looking for that nugget. And, described it before on the show in terms of stand-up comedy. I love this bit from Norm Macdonald, where he was talking about stand-up comedy as sort of like a magic trick where you have to stimulate, or it's actually like an orgasm in some ways. Like, you have to stimulate someone's body to have like a involuntary reaction from just your words, just like saying something and they go, and they have this involuntary reaction of laughter. And not only do it, but do it to like everybody all at once. That's a tricky thing. And it is kind of there's a magic to it. And not only that, but he's like, if you can get like the biggest one to happen at the end, then that's like the key to like wrapping it all up. It's a hard thing to pull off, but I think it's great that Carlin is identifying that there are other impulses there beyond the laughter. There's the kind of like revelatory, the like kind of like the sigh of revelation. It's not just ha ha ha, he said fart, but like something of like, oh shit, I understand something I didn't get before. Chris Rock has a lot of bits like that, especially in the 90s about race, where I'm just like, and I don't even know if they're correct. They're the bits that like Michael Scott does on The Office, right? Where you're kind of like, Oh, I'd never really seen it that way before. And he was consciously, I mean, talk about a guy that Chris Rock that was hanging out with people at Columbia University, Black studies professors trying to figure out how to like take those truths or ideas about race and package them in a way that were really funny. And he was really successful in that in the 90s. And I think he would probably cite George Carlin as a major influence too. But either way, that idea of the revelation is funny because that clip of him that you sent to me, that's probably one of his more famous later bits where it's a big club and you ain't in it. He has the line, they call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. Those aren't, I mean, they're kind of like tweets. You know what I mean? Like that's a tweet. It's called American Dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. It's totally a tweet. And it's a tweet that would go viral because people would be like, yes. And it's not necessarily funny. Ha ha. Like, I mean, in that bit, he's like, I've watched that clip a million times because people share it all the time. And every time I see it, I'm like, I got to watch this again because like it psychs you up. But he's like, they're coming for your social security. They're going to fucking get it. They'll get everything. Don't look for anything to get better. It's only going to get worse. Be happy with what you have. And it's like, they don't care about you. They don't fucking care about you. They don't fucking care about. And he repeats that. And the crowd is going nuts clapping. And it's sort of like, is this comedy? Or is this like where's the comedy here? He's literally just saying the powers in this country don't fucking care about you or your family. And the crowd's like, yeah. And kind of like, is that just a truth that we all recognize that he had just packaged? Yeah.
The thing that I think comedy announces, successful comedy, at least in theory, is that when you cross the taboo, no matter what you say, whether it's like a funny ha-ha punchline or just simply like a repressed truth, that when you cross the line, there's pleasure. And the pleasure isn't always funny, but it's always stimulating and it's always some version of pleasurable. And so part of the trick is to always figure out what's the contradiction, what's the cliche, how do I go to it, and what's past that point.
Yeah.
And I think the irony of all this, and we've said this with Elvis and we've said this with Billie Holiday, we've said this so many times, the irony of this is when you take down the church, or when you take down various ideological churches in seeking out that pleasure, not only will you create this like alternative, momentary, ephemeral church, which is the audience and the performer, but people will pay for it. And so at that exact site is capitalism's continuing revolution.
Yeah.
And capitalism finds a way to take the cultural moment of breaking the taboo and to, at that exact site, create capital and therefore inoculate in some ways the very power of the revelation that's being expressed.
I love that. Yeah, that's Colonel Parker's Tom Hanks, The Snow Job. What does he say? The snow job is the art of getting a rube to empty his wallet, leaving nothing but a smile on his face. And the key to getting the rube to smile is to show him something that he's not sure he should enjoy. Like, I fucking love that. Like, that's something from the Elvis movie that I'll take with me. I brought up the snow job in the law class the other day. The art of getting a rube to empty his wallet with nothing but a smile on his face is so good. Because there's something just that it's like Carlin, right? It gets to the heart. It's rude and crude and gets to the heart of something about capitalism. I know we got to go. But there's one more, a contradiction I want to mention, but because it fits with Carlin and the language thing and the power of comedy. And you're like, is this comedy or not? I remember I've mentioned this many times. I was deeply influenced by reading Roger Ebert's reviews of movies in the 90s. It was one of the first websites I went onto, and he had all his movies reviews on there. And one of them was, I like to read the 0-star reviews, the ones he hated. And he hated this movie that was called, I think, Dice Rules, the Andrew Dice Clay stand-up comedy film from like 1988, 1989. And Ebert was just, Ebert was like liberal guy who was just like, I'm disgusted by this because of the language he uses, the attitude he shows towards women, minorities, gay people. But he's like, but it's not really the comedy I hate. And I remember this because I read these reviews so many times. I remember his language. Ebert said, it's not really the comedy and the content of the comedy. That's part of it. but it's the crowd at Madison Square Garden that he sold out like 3 nights in a row. Andrew Dice Clay is famous for being the first comic to sell out Madison Square Garden. And the rafters are shaking with dudes who are just fucking loving this shit. And Ebert is like, to me, I saw what demagoguery is. Like, I saw the power of the Fourth Reich, basically, in Madison Square Garden. And I know his language is kind of over the top, but it locates, I think, the power that we're talking about partly of stand-up comedy and politics and language as having intense power. And that's part of, like, you know, why I think I don't really fall into one camp one way or the other in terms of the whole language police conversation, because I think we've identified it all here, and Carlin does too, as a big trap.
Well said. You know, and so I think we have a lot to go on here. I have some supplemental Carlin theory now for future shows, and it does seem like when we do these performance-based shows, these thematic shows on performers, that there is a lot of common threads and material. So I hope we continue with that.
Yeah, same here. And I think that this fits in with the Zinn trilogy and the Chomsky trilogy. And I'm really happy that we sit down and talk about these, like, I don't know, these are sort of like titans of the left counterculture and kind of political scene of 20th century. And they're worth examining beyond just the kind of like, I love these guys and I'm putting a poster on my wall. You know what I mean? Like, I think, you know, as you pointed out, Noam Chomsky is a friend of Jeffrey Epstein, and we know that now. These are contradictory figures, but I don't know. I'm joking, but you know what I'm saying. I think that, you know, learning about Howard Zinn and talking about him with you about his experiences in World War II in particular, something I'm still thinking about. So yeah, we pack it all in, and I'm sure Carlin will come up again in our adventures. So thank you, Justin. Always good to speak with you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
talk to you soon.
talking again. Yeah.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.